I'm honored to introduce our next two speakers, Laszlo Bock from Google, interviewed by Michael O'Hare of the Estée Lauder companies. Michael is the Executive Vice President of Global Human Resources and works with the recruitment, retention, compensation, and development of over 80,000 employees. He's also an avid cyclist, so ask him about that over lunch. With Michael's background at Estée Lauder and also previously Pepsi, both of which are large, prestigious, and very innovative firms, he will definitely have some great questions for our interviewee, Laszlo. Laszlo is the Senior Vice President of the People Operations Department at Google, which is a pretty big deal. Google is the first name that comes to most people's minds when asked which companies are at the forefront of people analytics. Laszlo also just published a book this week called Work Rules, so we're very honored to have him here during what is sure to be a very busy time for him. Without further ado, Mr. Michael O'Hare and Laszlo Bock.
Let's talk about the book itself. I'm very interested why you decided to write the book and why now.
So I decided to write the book because Google's this amazing place, and from the outside it looks amazing. From the inside, it's like any other place, warts and all. But I got to thinking that for too many people, work just sucks. Work is just not pleasant. It's a means to an end. It's a way to make a buck, and it doesn't have enough meaning to it, enough pleasure to it. And if you do the math, you actually spend more time working than you do just about anything else in life. I mean, nobody works 40-hour weeks anymore. So you spend more time working typically than you actually do sleeping. You spend more time working than you do on your hobbies, more time working than you do actually with the people you love the most. And if you're going to invest all that time, it should mean something. It should motivate you. You should love it. And at Google, I've been lucky enough not only to be part of a team where we can run all kinds of experiments on how to make people happier and more productive, but also be exposed to all kinds of great institutions and learn from them. And the book's really an effort to kind of open source what we've learned at Google and from these other institutions and make work better in other places.
So let's talk about human resources. You have actually quite a few HR professionals in the room. And in your book, you talk about the difference in terms of the profiles of people that you hire. So a third of Google's people operations have traditional, and then you have a mix. They have a mix of people from psychology and physics. Talk about the advantage of having people in HR with non-traditional HR backgrounds.
Yeah, well, the advantage is, and we have three different types of folks. Traditional HR folks, about a third of our people. Folks from consulting backgrounds, traditionally strategy consultancies, not HR consultancies, and people with analytics backgrounds. And the idea is they each bring something different to the party. So traditional HR people, they understand people, great intuition, they know how to deal with a problematic situation, great org design skills. The consultants understand the business really well, and they understand how to take a complex problem and structure it and break it down and kind of be hypothesis-driven in solving it. And the folks with the strong academic backgrounds and the quant backgrounds actually force us to prove that all this stuff we're saying actually works. And what ends up happening is a lot of them enter in our people analytics department, but then they get spread out across every part of people operations in the company. It just becomes part of the fabric of how we look at every problem.
Do you not believe that HR people should actually understand the business in much more granularity?
I think everyone should understand what they're doing. I mean, I think it's a trick question because because I love all HR people, of course. But I think HR is a profession, and we have talked about this in the past. For 30 years has been saying, we need a seat at the table, we need a seat at the table, we need a seat at the table. And it sort of said, well, you got to understand the business. So a bunch of people got MBAs and said, okay, now I understand the business, now I need a seat at the table. And the issue is, you actually need to just prove that what you're doing works. And so I think it's more than just understanding an income statement. It's actually being able to demonstrate that if I say performance management should work a certain way, or that we should stop running ads to recruit for employees, I need to be able to prove that's actually the right thing to do. And that's more than just understanding the business. That takes some analytic muscle.
Okay, so let's talk about a key decision in terms of HR and in the business, which is the whole idea of talent acquisition. So talk us through talent acquisition within Google and how you use analytics and how the process has changed, what you put in versus what it was in the past.
Yeah, so when I joined, and this, by the way, this isn't all to my credit. I mean, we have amazing people. There was this great guy, Todd Carlisle, who was an IO psychologist, who was our staffing analyst at the time, and came up with all these fantastic ideas. And a lot of what I did was just kind of say, yeah, go do that, do that. And we've got a fantastic team working on these problems now. But when I joined, it was really a brute force effort. The idea was, let's hire as many people as we can, because that was our biggest constraint to growth. We didn't have headcount targets, we didn't have budgets. It was hire as many people as you can. And so we had lots and lots of recruiters doing a good job. But we had a few problems with our process. One was that it took forever. It took 6 months, sometimes as long as 9 months to get hired by the company. The second was it just wasn't fun. I remember coming out to and riding around with a realtor or going to restaurants, and everybody had a story about their bad interview experience at Google. And the last thing was we were really biased towards people with fancy degrees and GPA. And we required everyone to submit their SAT scores. You could be a 50-year-old and apply to Google, and we would say, we need to see your college transcript and your SAT scores. And if they weren't high enough, often we would pass on you. And all those were mistakes. So we did a lot of math, we did a lot of experiments, and we found things like the optimal number of interviews for a candidate to get to 86% predictive power whether or not we should move forward is 4 interviews. So we just implemented a policy and said any more than 4 needs my approval, and it went from 6 months to something like 47 days. We did a bunch of analysis and found that grades and where you went to school, grades are a little predictive for your first 2 years, but for the rest of your career don't matter at all. And where you went to school, sorry Wharton friends, also doesn't really matter. What matters is the education you got and your ability to learn. So now we screen for all of those things instead. And we know those things are predictive.
Do you have a point of view about first-tier universities, second-tier universities being at the top end of a second-tier university versus the middle of a top university? In other words, have you thought about just the segmentation, whether somebody who's succeeded and therefore succeeds more in the future? Have you found any data as relates to that?
Well, we haven't done the particular math on, if you're number 10 at Harvard versus number 1 at SUNY Binghamton, like who ends up performing better. But I did talk to a friend who, he's a very, very senior operating executive at an investment bank, one of the top few investment banks. They did the math. And what they found was, no surprise, the very best students from any school outperform sort of the average students, or even the sort of 60th, 70th percentile students at name your Ivy League university, or West Coast University, right? Stanford's no different. And so there's actually evidence to suggest, although we haven't done the experiment yet, to say that, first of all, as a recruiter, you're better off going and casting a wider net, which is what we do. We now recruit at almost 1,000 different schools. And then there's also evidence emerging that psychologically for you, you're better off being in a reference group where you can really feel special and excel. Because we all have this human error where we always kind of, we get something, we habituate quickly, and we say, what's next? And so we're always a little dissatisfied. And by architecting your reference group to one where you can actually be a little above average or a lot above average, there's some early evidence to suggest you actually end up happier in life.
So can you give me an example of the difference of one great hire? So bringing one great hire into an organization and the importance of that and what it can mean for an organization if you do it correctly.
Yeah, well, so we at Google, we bias our hiring process to avoid false positives at almost all costs. So we only want to hire, and we pass on a lot of great people as a result, because our philosophy is we'd much rather have a company of 80th or 90th percentile performers and then have the performance distribution around that than hire a bunch of average people, which by definition is what most companies do, and try to make them better. So Alan Eustace, who was our head of engineering for years and years and years, he recently retired, but he used to say, one great engineer is worth 300 great engineers. And if you think about it, back in 98 or 99, when Larry and Sergey were still at Stanford, they built the Google search engine and they tried to sell it. And they went to this company, I think they went to InfoSeek and said, you can have Google for $1 million. And InfoSeek said, no, that's way too expensive, it's not worth it. So they went to Yahoo, and the venture capitalist who was working with them, this guy Vinod Khosla, he said, your price is too high, you should only ask $750,000 for this, because no one's going to pay $1 million for Google. And Yahoo passed as well. And so the question I ask is, how much would it have been worth to hire one of these guys? How much would it have been worth to hire a Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or any of these exceptional people? And when you look at human performance, there's fascinating research by 2 academics named O'Boyle and Agenis. And they actually look at human performance across a whole bunch of fields, and they argue persuasively, and I believe it, that it's not a normal distribution, it's a power law distribution. And there's far more people at the very far end of performance than a normal model would predict, and they generate far more value. And when we look at that in sales and engineering, we see the same thing. So not only are great performers invaluable, and not only should you try to get as many as you can by changing your hiring processes, but they're way more valuable than our intuition would lead us to believe.
And you also, can you talk, and I listened to you yesterday as well, and you talked about looking at some of the competencies and the behaviors of some of the managers in the organization And you talked about yourself in terms of your own percentile. I won't embarrass you with what that number was. But when you look at the high performers, have you correlated back into their performance, and have you seen defined performance over time? And then the people that come into their team, has their performance fundamentally changed as well?
Yeah, so what Michael's referring to is this piece of work we did years ago called Project Oxygen, where we tried to figure out what makes managers exceptional. And deep in the methodology, and I touch on this, but we hadn't talked about it publicly before, we didn't just sort of say who's good and who's bad. We actually said, you know, among the best, let's look at the top quartile within the top quartile, and then actually study their behaviors and their conduct and see what they do differently. But the only way to know if the behaviors we identify actually drive performance of teams is to actually cause people to switch teams, right? But it would be kind of a cruel thing to take a bunch of people from a great manager and say, now you have to go work for a crummy manager, right? But we were lucky in that we had a natural experiment because Google employees, Googlers, are always switching jobs and changing jobs. So we had a set of people who were bad performers, working for bad managers, who went to work for great managers, and people moving the other direction as well. And what we found, fortunately and amazingly, was that being a bad performer and working for a good manager actually then makes you a better performer. So these actions that the managers take actually have measurable material consequences in terms of performance. And it was a beautiful, beautiful finding. And then we've corroborated since then. But it's really neat stuff.
Have you ever thought about, so you provide these statistics to the managers, have you ever thought about, and you do a lot of transparency within the organization, making that much more transparent around, you know, open sourcing or crowdsourcing about feedback on managers in a very live way?
Yeah, we've thought about this. And a lot of companies we have all kinds of internal recognition and feedback systems. There's a whole bunch. We've been careful about how much manager feedback we make public to the whole company versus keep private. And the reason is when you muddy developmental feedback with performance feedback, people's ability to learn tends to shut down. They get defensive. You've all worked with people who, you know, are kind of struggling, and you go to them and say, hey, things aren't going so well, and they know it's going to impact their promotion, their salary increase, what have you, and they devote all kinds of energy to arguing for why you don't understand, my performance is fine, you know, you manager just don't get it, and let me just spend 2 weeks documenting all of this and then meet with you every week for the next 6 months to explain to you why I'm great. And as a manager, you kind of go like, oh God, okay, just take the bonus. So the incentives are all messed up. So that's part of it. We want our managers to be open to developing. And one way to do that is by removing the performance stick from giving the feedback. The other thing, though, is, so we have annual employee surveys, and twice a year every manager gets upward feedback. And the manager, if you have more than 100 direct reports, it's made public. But for the employee survey, for the upward feedback survey, it's up to you, and whether you want to share it. And we make it optional because there are actually cases where a manager's got to do a turnaround. And the problem is if you have a manager whose ratings look really low, but they've come in and she's trying to make the team better, and she's being really tough, and she's firing people, and she's moving people around, the team's going to be unhappy. And we don't want everyone else in the organization to go like, oh, she's a terrible manager. She's in fact one of our best. But from the outside world, without that context, it's going to look bad, and we instead want her focused on doing the right thing.
Okay, so take us through the journey about how you brought the organization to, including the senior leaders and the executive team, around using data in a much more robust way. So where did you start, and how have you convinced them over time? Because you have quite a few people in the room that are practitioners, and they're thinking about, okay, how would I do this with my senior team, and then where should I start, and as versus swamping. So tell me a little bit about how that worked, and successes and failures.
Well, first I have to give a caveat. When I was writing the book, so I've never done this before, and the publisher kept urging me to like tell more stories about myself and say, you know, I did this, and that's why it opens with like, you know, here was my first job, and it's super uncomfortable to do that, both constitutionally for me, but also because at Google our culture is very much we do things together, and so. It's been an incredible team effort doing all of this kind of stuff, partnering with remarkable, remarkable people, a lot of whom are here today. But the biggest thing that we have done together is actually we fought tremendous resistance from day one. Like you kind of have to imagine that, you know, Google's an engineering company. It's easy to say data, data, data. But the effect of that, for those of you who work with engineers, is engineers often have, and my brother's an engineer, my dad's an engineer, so I can say this, is that they're really good at one set of problems and really smart, and so they extrapolate that they're good at all kinds of problems and know better. And Google also has a culture of, the engineers, the employees run the company. So it's very much they design the systems and then we help and inform. So I joined. I wanted to do talent management and succession planning. It's 2 years after IPO, and Eric Schmidt told me, that's all a waste of time. That's a terrible idea. And he had a very different perspective. I was like, this is not going well. So I focused on staffing for the first year. And even then, what if we limit the number of interviews? Nope, we know what we're doing. We know how we're doing it. It took 3 years to convince Google and make the case to move away from GPA and test scores and where you went to school. And the mechanism for all of these things, for almost all of them, was to start with small pilots. One of the virtues of growth, of size, people say, oh, it's a big company, it's hard to do things. The virtue is it's easy to carve out 5, 10, 50, 100 people. When we designed our new performance management system, we did a small experiment on only 6,500 of our employees, where we had like 8 different systems running in parallel to figure out what was best. And I think that's the key in a lot of the work we do, because all of our clients, all the people we work with and partner with, they all think they're really good at people stuff, right? Because our intuition is, I'm a keen judge of character, I of course make fair decisions, I'm completely unbiased, and we all make unfair decisions, and we're not great judges of character, and we're all biased. So running small pilots and experiments is a way to get there and build the credibility and prove that it works.
And were you disproportionately investing within your own department in that area, secretly, at least initially?
Yes, yeah. So when I joined, there was a person working in staffing named Todd Carlisle, who I mentioned, who was a staffing analyst. There was a woman named Michelle Donovan working in benefits, who was a benefits analyst. Much like you'd have at any company, there was a gentleman, Mario, working in compensation, comp analyst. And I said, okay, you three are now a team, and you're an analytics team. And I remember one of them saying, like, I don't want to do this. This is the dumbest thing in the world. because he said, I really like this area of work. And this is my research background, and I'm really excited by these kinds of questions. This other stuff I don't care about. And then at Google, so year 1, we had no headcount constraints. My next year, we introduced headcount, and all of a sudden, I couldn't hire everyone I wanted, and so I deliberately underfunded the other teams. So recruiting always got funding, because that was the most important thing, still is. The second is in terms of the company growth and trajectory. The second thing I then invested in was people analytics. And for my first 3 years, we didn't have a training or people development department, because I had a choice. Do I want to build that, or do I want to build this analytic muscle? And that's where I placed my bet.
And how big is it now?
We don't share that number.
Okay.
But it's pretty good size.
Okay, sizable.
It's
All right. So let's talk about
bigger than 2, less than 100.
Perfect.
If that helps.
So talk about transparency. So some of the information that you share has been given to the board and other sensitive data. Talk about the decision to have increased transparency in what you show and how that's evolved.
With the company? Or
Yes.
Yeah. Some of the things about Google, we just got lucky. So Larry and Sergey, when the company was about 50 or 80 people, they decided it's kind of hard to know what everyone's doing, so let's just have a weekly all hands and tell everyone what's going on. And they'd have pizza and beer, because that's what you do when you're 24 years old, and maybe when you're 40 years old, maybe also when you're 60 years old. I'll report back. And so they would just share everything going on in the company. And it evolved into this thing called TGIF. Thank God it's Friday, which we of course do on Thursday. And we do it on Thursday actually because we have thousands of employees in Asia. Yeah. And so if you do it Thursday afternoon, they can watch it live. So, and our New York office has always done it on Thursday because New Yorkers duck out early on Friday. So they were ahead of us. But
so it's their Friday.
It's their Friday, exactly.
Right.
But we've always had this kind of impulse of sharing information. And I remember my first TGIF, Friday after I joined, because it was still on Fridays, and somebody had leaked something in the company. Somebody had leaked the blueprint for a Google product called the Google Mini, basically Google in a box, a server. And the person had been fired, because we don't tolerate leaks in the company. And not tolerating leaks allows us to share a lot of information internally, because you don't have to worry about, is this confidential or not. And Eric Schmidt, our CEO at the time, started TGIF by putting up on screen in front of everybody, here is the blueprint. Here's all the technical specifications. Here's the link to where to find it if you want to learn more. He made a point of sharing it with everyone. And he said, please don't share this outside. Someone did. That person's not here anymore. We need to be able to speak completely freely with one another, but that needs to stay here so that we can continue doing it. And it's worked beautifully.
Fantastic. Tell us about, on all of the data research that you've done, what has been the most surprising? What has surprised you the most in terms of, from at least a behavioral perspective, that you didn't expect?
The most surprising thing is actually the work we've been doing on unconscious bias. We made a decision a year ago to publicize or make public our diversity statistics, which we look a lot like the tech industry, which means we don't look great. On the non-technical side, it's 50-50 men and women. On the technical side, it's only 17% women. So as a company, we're about 30-70. And we want to do better, and we wanted to put a stake in the ground, and we're going to re-release our numbers. But a lot of diversity programs cause people to kind of shut down because you go and say, you need diversity training, and people say like, well, I don't have a problem, or I think it's stupid, or why is my company telling me what to think? The coolest thing that we found is that you don't actually have to convince people to change their belief system to get them to create a more inclusive environment. What you have to do is make them pause and reflect a little bit and sort of disconnect from their amygdala and kind of be rational for a minute. So we have this unconscious bias training program. If you look on YouTube and Google unconscious bias, Google Ventures, a rough video will come up. We're planning on putting more out, giving it away later this year. But it starts with kind of optical illusions and then progresses from there. And then there's an implicit association test that Harvard has put out that you can take. And you walk people through this, and everyone kind of realizes, oh, I got this wrong. Oh, and I'm a little biased here. And by the end of it, people realize their decision-making is not as rational and logical as we think it is, and that it is possible we might be a little biased. And then we see all these beautiful changes in behavior in the company resulting from it. So the surprise has been, you don't need to change people's beliefs. You don't need to force them through training. You just need to make them aware of the kind of stuff Daniel Kahneman writes about in Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, that you're not always making the right decisions, or the last gentleman talked about. And if you can step back and pause for a moment to reflect, you actually make unbiased decisions, not just related to diversity, but related to promotions, performance ratings, compensation. It's been remarkable.
Anything interesting, because you're a global company, that you find beyond the United States that you could also share in terms of bias that exists?
Yeah, we actually had this question. I was in our Tokyo office, and we did this funny thing in Tokyo where, well, actually, I'll be sensitive to time. We did this really interesting thing, but time prevents me from sharing the details with you. So it was amazing, though. It was like unbelievable. But the punchline is we got a question. I was there doing an all hands, and I got a question. And I lived in Japan. I spent time teaching in Japan. I worked in Japan for a while.
You speak Japanese?
A little bit, yeah. And so the Japanese culture as it relates to women is very different from the United States. Somebody asked, if push comes to shove, we have this Japanese culture where the woman's role in the meeting is kind of, to take notes, or even if she's an equal, she's going to be the one I ask to go get tea for everyone in the meeting, because that's just how it is in Japan. Who wins, the Google culture or the national culture? And I said, Google culture. And if you're not comfortable with that, that's okay. It's not about changing Japan. Japan's a great place. But it is about being true to who we are and our values. And we sometimes see this kind of thing internationally, but at the end of the day, we're human beings. We want to treat people well, and I think that's a universal thing.
Okay, so the last thing is, before we close, just for you to give advice to people, which is practitioners that are out there that are thinking about fundamentally taking this on. What would you do day one, and what advice would you give HR practitioners about taking this forward in terms of people analytics?
So, number one, hire somebody with a quant background, and a semester or two of MBA level statistics is all you need on this. Even undergraduate statistics, that's all you need, or an operations course or two. Just some basic statistical techniques to be able to tell random variation from like actual, cause-driven variation. So that's one. Number two, you don't need like a huge team. You don't need tons of infrastructure or special technology. You can do this stuff like in Google Spreadsheets or Microsoft Excel. Or you can do it with pen and paper. So you don't need a lot of resources. Number three, pick a problem that both matters to the business and is interesting to you. So an easy one to start with is, people are always looking at sales figures. Well, figure out whether the sales improvement is random variation or whether it's related to a cause, right? Or look at whether there's a performance difference between different categories of people and why that's happening. And prove some value. And finally, I'd say, once you found something important, find somebody who cares about it and share it with them, and ask them, or just force yourself into running an actual experiment where you say, okay, here's what we found. Now let's take two little groups, and it doesn't matter if they're 5-person groups or 500-person groups, and we're going to treat them differently. We're going to have a control and an experiment, and let's see what happens. And that is the basic building block to building credibility to do all kinds of crazy rocket science.
Okay, so final comment is read the book. So thank you, Laszlo.
Thank you very much.
you.